The Russia-Africa summit held in Moscow marked a new chapter in the bilateral relations between Russia and the African continent. The summit, attended by 17 heads of state and governments from Africa, representatives of about 49 countries, the Russian President Vladimir Putin and African Union Commission Chairperson Moussa Faki Mahamat, was aimed at enhancing partnerships in various sectors from economics to security to technology, education and the likes. Now, one of the notable agreements at the two-day event was a writing off of about $23 billion of debt burden and a $5 billion investment package for from Russia to various African countries, which was aimed at fostering development in sectors such as infrastructure, mining and agriculture. Now, as part of the economic discussions, President Putin emphasized Russia's interest in African natural resources in exchange for expertise and investment support. Now, will this alignment of interests boost Africa's economic growth and diversification that it is looking out for? So this morning to talk about this, I have with me Lekan Satchu, Africa Geo-economist and macro analyst, including the CEO, Reach Management. It's nice to have you join us, Lekan, on the show.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
So this is the second edition of the Russia-Africa Summit. How significant was it to have these countries, these countries on this continent, and of course, Russia come to table to talk in the face of Western pressure and European subtle romance along economic lines?
So I think, the overarching situation is that the more partners Africa has, the better it's able to strike trade deals, it's better deals it's able to get for its minerals and so forth. So I think from an African perspective, it makes perfect sense to have as many counterparties as possible, and Russia is one of those. Of course, if you look at the historical record, Russia does not carry the baggage of colonialism. It supported a lot of the independence parties who was fighting for independence. So it's got a very powerful narrative and history to leverage. If you look at the recent drive, Russia obviously has been at loggerheads with the West over the Ukraine war and has been pivoting east and pivoting south. And I think this summit is to be seen in the context of Russia's pivot, which has gained traction, momentum since the Ukraine war, a desire to increase its trade, increase its investments with the African continent. And I think that's the context I would paint.
So part of the deals by Russia from the east to the south has to do with a $5 billion investment package for Russia, from Russia rather, to these African countries, and the allocation of an additional $90 million, while also writing off $23 billion in debt burden. So in the context of these, what other concrete agreements were reached during the summit, and how do you feel this will be important and significant for the growth of Africa's economy?
So there were a series of things that came out of this particular summit. As you said, there was a substantial debt write-off. That was a very progressive move and a helpful move in the context of an indebted continent which is currently struggling with its debt load. So I think that was a powerful message to send. I think Putin then also spoke about the issue of grain. This has been a subject du jour for African countries. Bear in mind, only about 3.1% of Ukrainian grain exports went to Africa anyway. But the promise Putin made was that he would deliver free grain to certain countries and also make sure there was sufficient supply of Russian grain to meet the potential shortfall of grain from Ukraine. So I think that was another interesting development. On top of that, we had some announcements regarding the possibility of setting up Russian universities in some African countries. But interestingly, there are some things that were there but were not obvious. So, for example, you will note that Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner Group, was very visible at this particular summit. We've had the recent coup in Niger. Again, that sort of story and narrative is out there of an increasing Russian push on the continent, which is also to do with democratic security, and is in conflict with the US and with the French, for example, in particular. So there's a lot going on, and we should not underestimate what is happening. Russia is not at the level in trade terms of the European Union or China, but the trade growth has been significant over the last decade, and I expect it to continue to grow fast.
So with these promises as regards trade and finance that Russia is given to Africa, isn't Russia doing a little too much to curry favor from these African leaders? And don't you think that these African leaders should be wary of baits that may seek to further legitimize the illegal plunder of its natural resources? Because Putin has made it categorically clear that it has eyes for Africa's natural resources.
So I think the argument Putin is making that currently Africa is not getting sufficient value for its resources. You could take the example of Niger, where Niger's uranium powers 1 in 3 light bulbs in France. But Niger, by all accounts, is one of the poorest countries, not only on the African continent, but in the world. So the argument Russia is making, look, we can help you with value addition, beneficiation of your natural resources. We don't want to just come and plunder those resources. Of course, the proof will be in the pudding. You can make promises and you can promise anything you want. But at the end of the day, I think the proof is in the pudding. And I think it'll be interesting to watch how Russia inserts itself into the natural resource story on the African continent. But there seem to be plenty of willing African partners, who particularly I noticed some comments from the current leader of Burkina Faso. He was very aggressive in his commentary about the potential for that type of partnership. But you're quite correct. We've yet to see what will come of this, but there is plenty of potential. And if Russia is prepared to play a fairer, more equitable game, then I think they'll find partners all over the African continent.
All right, talking about potentials and interests on the both sides. Now, how will these actually strengthen bilateral ties between these two entities in areas of the promotion of investments, facilitation of development of the value chains, and of course, boosting capacity, production, export, and manufacturing of goods and export of these goods to Russia and probably other countries that may be needing African products? How will these help Africa?
So I think that's a very interesting question. And of course, execution is everything. You can sign all kinds of agreements, but if you don't execute on the ground, nothing will happen. But what I've noticed with the whole Russian engagement with the African continent is a use of multilateral institutions. For example, Afreximbank has been very much a conduit for that Russia-Africa cooperation for quite a while. I think they have probably, of all the African multilaterals, they have the biggest advantage in terms of building that bridge between between Russia and Africa. You bear in mind, a big story here is the BRICS currency, the potential for the BRICS currency, the increased expectation of trade in local currencies. So it's something like the BRICS vehicle, the BRICS Bank, could be a vehicle to cement and grow this cooperation and collaboration. So I suspect Russia will utilize multilateral institutions which they feel comfortable with, and essentially the BRICS umbrella will probably be the most useful vehicle to deepen this engagement. And also, of course, as I said, Afreximbank, which if I remember correctly, held a conference in Russia not too long ago. They seem to have the ear of the Russian administration, and I'm sure they can play a good role in making this work.
All right, so looking at Europe and US policymakers who until recently saw China as their main competitor in Africa, but now that we're seeing Russia's assertive return to the global sphere, now will there be some sort of worry on the part of these world powers whereby they are seeing a weakening in their influence in Africa? And will that also pose a potential risk for Africa's economic relationship with these powerhouses?
That's a very interesting question. I mean, for a long time, of course, we had that whole argument about China, debt trap diplomacy and all of that. But increasingly, we've seen Western powers uncomfortable and unhappy with the Russian presence on the African continent. In particular, we've seen stories about disinformation, anti-French propaganda coming out of Western powers. And then, you don't have to be a rocket scientist to see what's going on in the Sahel and in West Africa, where there seems to be a deep structural unhappiness with the French influence. And we are seeing at a groundswell movement in favor of Russia and against France. So yes, I think Western powers who've long been our historical partners on the continent are not comfortable with the increased Russian presence on the African continent. And I think it's going to be a juggling act for many of our African countries. To give you a good example is a situation which is currently unfolding in Niger. The question is, will ECOWAS, for example, lean on the side of intervention in Niger? And that will be seen, I think, by many people as favoring the ancien regime of the French versus maybe the new insurgent politics of these military leaders who are speaking a much more Russian language than we've ever seen before.
All right, that's one big conversation that we get to look at in our subsequent shows. But then in a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin before the summit anyway, the president of BRICS New Development Bank, that is Dilma Rousseff, said there are no obstacles for the countries of the developing world to carry out their foreign trade operations in national currency. So are these African countries with the full adoption of AFCFTA primed for this, despite the poor and fluctuating currency values?
So that's a super question. I mean, what we're seeing obviously is with the new settlement system that Afreximbank have proposed, which is to allow increased local currency settlement of intra-African trade, we're already seeing African countries pushing at least rhetorically in that direction. And generally, if we look around the world today, we can see this trend, de-dollarization trend, which is gaining momentum. Of course, it's not a regime change moment. The dollar is not going to be dethroned tomorrow, but clearly there is a trend change going on. And I see no reason why African countries should not avail themselves of this opportunity to dilute the influence of the dollar, which frankly can cause a lot of pain. As you know, Nigeria is a good example of the currency pressure. Egypt has been another one. So I think we're definitely going to see a move away from the dollar and more trade settlement, in particular in local currency. I don't think we're going to see massive change in reserves composition at this point in time, but increased settlement of intra-African trade in local currency seems to me a no-brainer and a good starting point.
All right, well, it's been said that Africa might not really be fully ready when it comes to positioning itself at an advantage position to benefit from these courtings from these superpowers. Maybe they'll be able to have that time to begin to tighten their knots and see how they can benefit more, even as these superpowers begin or continue this romance with the African continent. Lekan Satchu, Africa Geo-economist and macro analyst, including CEO of Reach Management. Thank you so much for your time on the show.
Thank you.